Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by People Management Insight in partnership with Nudge. My name is Jenny Roper and I'm editor of People Management magazine. I'll be moderating today's discussion from home, of course, so bear with me if there are any technical issues, hopefully there won't be, or if you hear my other half coming into the kitchen on a quest for a snack. Today, we'll be talking about how to create a strategy that truly supports your employees' well-being, an area that has been much talked about of late, of course, in relation to keeping staff safe amid the coronavirus outbreak. Specifically, we're going to be discussing financial well-being, an area, again, much in the spotlight at present, given the number of full-time but also freelance workers potentially being laid off or unable to work in the wake of COVID-19. To discuss the topic of employee financial wellbeing, I'm delighted to be joined by Nudge's co-founder, Tim Perkins, and Charles Cotton, Senior Performance and Reward Advisor at the CIPD. Tim, do you want to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, by all means. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Tim, co-founder of Nudge. For those people not aware of us, we're a workplace financial wellbeing provider who are delivering 100% independent, sales-free financial education to over 100 employers and close to 500,000 employees. We're really looking forward to introducing and discussing our latest research, which shows how to create a financial wellbeing strategy that works.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tim. Charles, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Hi, my name is Charles and I'm the Senior Advisor to the CIPD for Reward. Part of my role involves carrying out research on various reward topics, such as on employee financial well-being, as well as representing the views of our members to governments, such as on pensions or gender pay gap reporting. I'm not responsible for the reward at the CIPD, so please don't try and flog me a new payroll system or a voluntary benefits package.
Thanks for that, Charles. An important disclaimer. Thank you both for joining us today. So I'm just going to set the scene a little bit before we get going and before I hand over to Tim. So today we'll be debating how employers can create a genuinely effective, comprehensive financial wellbeing strategy, rather than relying on a collection of benefits that restrict individuals to a fixed, limited menu of transactions. We're going to hopefully be exploding the myth that benefits in isolation improve financial wellbeing and discussing the way in which financial wellbeing is actually an outcome. And so it's about having the knowledge and skills to make the most of an income, high or low, and enjoy a comfortable and contented quality of life. In this People Management Insight webinar, produced in partnership with Nudge, Tim, Charles and I will discuss the findings of Nudge's recent white paper, Breaking the Great Wellbeing Myth, which explored 300,000 people's financial habits and their stress levels. We'll see how the financial wellbeing landscape is evolving and discuss how financial benefits can best be integrated into a virtuous wellbeing circle. Before we start, just a bit of housekeeping to say, please get involved wherever you are, probably sitting at home, I'm guessing at the moment. We'd love to hear your thoughts on a couple of polls as we go, so do submit your responses to those. And please also do submit questions and comments at any time using the box below the slideshow. You might need to exit the full screen mode to see it. The webinar will also be available on demand from tomorrow, so do share with your colleagues, rewatch, or catch up on the bits you missed when the phone rang. And now I'm going to hand over to you, Tim.
Superb. Thank you very much, Jenny. So I thought I would start with a poll, something to get the blood pumping, which hopefully you'll be able to all see in the bottom of your presentation screen now. So have a quick look over all of these icons. So these are all potential things that will impact your personal finances. So just have a quick think about how many of these have impacted your personal finance in the last year. Okay, tick the relevant number on the poll and we'll revisit the answer there in a minute. Whilst you're doing that, I'll give a bit of context to this session in light of the, quite frankly, crazy world that we're in right now. So it's widely recognised that a wellbeing strategy encompasses three pillars: health, mental and financial well-being. And whilst coronavirus is clearly manifesting itself as a health matter and undoubtedly causing mental wellness issues, as we're seeing, the bigger knock-on impact is the financial shadow that it's leaving behind, not just at a macroeconomic level, but also on a personal level, essentially financial well-being. So as this thing unravels, your people are going to need your wellbeing support like never before. And it's these next few months where those well-planned and structured wellbeing strategies are going to come into their own. Now, as an HR professional, you can't really influence the spread of coronavirus, but you can influence your people's ability to manage the long-lasting impact, which we expect to last long after the virus has come and gone. Giving your people lifelong confidence and knowledge to make the most of their money is the key here, but it needs to adapt and it needs to change to these fast-moving times. So in this session, we'll demonstrate what we mean when we say that financial well-being is living and breathing. I believe that the CIPD has done some work in this area, Charles, is that right?
That's correct, Tim. A recent poll by the CIPD of 1,000 workers found that almost half would get into severe financial hardship within a month if they receive just statutory sick pay, which is around £94 a week. Fortunately, 48% of those we polled are covered by more generous company sick pay plans. The other half would have to rely on statutory sick pay or using their annual leave or just simply not getting paid. So these figures highlight the financial fragility of many of our employees. And things could get worse if firms start to lay off people. However, we would say to organisations, before they start thinking about doing that, would encourage them to check out all the government support that's on offer to firms to protect their staff.
Okay, fantastic. So looking at the poll results, I think as I suspected, so almost half of people have experienced 5 to 9 of those in the past 12 months, and 7% 10 to 15 of those changes. I wonder if any of those were lottery wins or the new pet, which you pointed out, Charles, was a zebra when we went for a run through earlier. So I think what that demonstrates is that we're all experiencing lots of change. Our financial lives are in constant flux. And these are just a tiny subset of the factors that can influence our financial wants and needs and how we feel about personal finance. If we consider the full set of factors that influence our financial well-being, they broadly fit into 3 categories. So firstly, you've got macro events. So that's economic, political, or social events, which under normal circumstances mean things like tax returns and Christmas and pay rises and so forth. And they tend to be pretty predictable. Now, clearly with coronavirus, it's a massive factor right now, which itself has resulted in 2 record-breaking interest rate cuts in just 10 days, an extraordinary input of monetary policy with a pledge of over £300 billion to the economy, and the effective nationalisation of our railways. So yeah, those macro events are hugely impactful on people's financial circumstances. You've then got people's personal life events. So these are the types of things that we saw on the previous slide with the poll. So these are the things that are personal to you, like having a baby or moving home, bereavement, those types of things. And then we, of course, have the influence of our own personal demographics. That might be our age, our salary, our partner's salary. It might even be where we live. So here in the UK, childcare support, for example, that differs region to region. So what you find is all of these things overlap and influence what we want, what we need, and feel, and together they shape the context in which we make our financial decisions. And I think there's 2 points worth emphasizing. The first is that this overall context is unique to all of us as individuals. We're all different and we're all impacted and influenced in different ways. And secondly, this context is constantly changing, whether that's changes to our own personal circumstances or at a macro level. Financial well-being is constantly changing, and therefore so too are your requirements for financial well-being support. The support needs to change as your circumstances are. Now, in our recent white paper, which you'll get a link to after this webinar, we examined the impact of each of these three areas on financial well-being. And what we're going to do is just give you a taster today. So we're going to take a quick look at one of those elements, which is the personal demographics. And specifically, over the course of the next of the session this afternoon, we've picked out some interesting examples of how gender, age, and salary impact two things. Firstly, the type of financial well-being support that employees are looking for, and secondly, the extent to which people are experiencing financial stress. Some of the data will validate commonly held beliefs, and some of it might just surprise you. So, a bit of information about our data that underpins the research. What we're about to reveal is the actual real-time analysis of the financial behaviours of 350,000 employees from 100 employers across the full calendar year, so across 12 months. Those employees range from 16 years old right up to over 90, and they represent every industry sector and geographical region. Now, we divide the world of finance into 25 different areas, and all of the content that people are learning about, all the support that they're getting, fits into one or more of these areas. So by tracking what people are learning about, we can better understand their wants and needs, which is obviously the important step to creating a strategy that helps them. So using that data, what this chart is going to reveal, and we're going to build it up step by step, is how areas of interest differ according to employees' ages. So as you can see along the x-axis, those areas of interest are budgeting, debt, government support, inheritance, investing, mortgages, pensions, savings, and tax. What we then do is break down by age bands, with the purple representing the youngest employees, so those less than 23 years of age, and the pink, the oldest, so those over 61. And then the y-axis shows us what percentage of employees in each age group are learning about that topic. So for example, with budgeting that we can see here in the bottom left, it shows that 8% of those youngest employees, so the less than 23-year-olds, are learning about budgeting. And for employees over 61 years of age, it's only 3% of them learning about budgeting. So as you can see, there's a downward trend there in budgeting as employees get older. Jenny, be useful to get your thoughts on that. Is that the shape that you would have expected in terms of interest in budgeting according to age?
Yeah, I think actually that is. It's easy to say that now, isn't it, when it's in front of me? You can see the result, but that is broadly what I'd have expected. I'm casting my mind back to when I was under 23 or just older than that, and I did actually have a little notebook where I jotted everything down because I actually only had £100 a week, I think it was at the time, for everything, and I had to be really starting off as a journalist on a journalist kind of wage, and I had to be so strict with myself. Whereas compare that to now, where I'm definitely not 23 or just over 23, and I am ashamedly a little bit more lax about keeping track of every single penny. So certainly in my own anecdotal experience, I think that does kind of concur and isn't a massive surprise to me.
No, and I think it's typically with earnings lowest amongst the youngest, I think it's probably not surprising to see that they are the most interested in budgeting. But what is interesting is if we compare this to what we saw 3 years ago, so that trend is definitely getting flatter. So budgeting is a growing problem for older people, which I can only see continuing as we have more and more people retiring without the luxury of those defined benefit pension schemes. So it'll be really interesting to track how that changes over time. So think about the next one, debt. Charles, do you think it will be an upward trend or a downward trend like budgeting?
I think it would also be a downward trend, Tim. I think that younger people, when you compare their levels of debt to their earnings, they're probably going to be more concerned about this issue compared to perhaps older people who've got higher earnings and also probably will have had opportunity to pay down some of the debts that they incurred when they were in their youth.
Yeah. Okay, so let's reveal. So yeah, we can see a slight downward trend there. So I think debt is connected to age because young people tend to have less money to spend. One quite frightening survey showed that 42% of millennials' earnings went to repaying debt, which is absolutely extraordinary, but I guess not surprising when you think about student debt that people get these days. So we're going to whiz through each of these one by one, but whilst we do that, perhaps we can open the poll again. So hopefully the poll is now showing again at the bottom of your screen. And so the poll question relates to investing, and we'll reveal the results of that in a minute. But in the meantime, I'd love to know, do people dialed in, do they think that investing will have an upward trend, so sloping from left to right, youngest to oldest, or a downward trend, sloping down from youngest to oldest? So perhaps if people could have a think about that. And whilst we're doing that, let me have a think. So government support. Jenny, what do you think the trend will be with regards to employees learning about government support? Upwards trend or downward trend?
I'm a bit stumped at this one, actually. I think this is maybe one of the harder ones, but I would assume an upward trend. This is where I really wish I'd properly studied the slides well in advance, instead of glancing through them as you did your run through. I think an upward trend as people's lives get more complicated and they're maybe more likely to need sickness support or disability support, or they're looking towards their pensions, although pensions are another category. I'm going to say upward, but I sense I might be actually wrong.
Okay, let's have a look. So no, you're right. So there's lots of content and support in Nudge related to government support. But looking at the actual detail of what people are learning about, a lot of the readership is related to pensions and tax allowances for retirement, which I think is why we see that upward trend of older people. It's interesting that there's obviously a high spike there amongst the youngest, and I can only assume that's because they are the lowest earners and therefore are looking for more support just to kind of make the most of those relatively small pay packets that they get. Charles, inheritance. What do you think? Upward trend or downward trend?
I'm assuming that as people age, they have more assets to kind of give away as inheritance gifts. So I'm assuming that it's an upward trend.
Okay, let's have a look. Yes, you're right. So let's have a look at this. Yeah, so upward trend, although I think that is obvious, but it is interesting thinking about it that the youngsters, the youngest group, are as interested as they are. Not sure if you've any comment, Charles, on why that might be. So that small spike for the very youngest?
Potentially when they're joining pension schemes, having to think about who would get their pension if they were unfortunately to die, death in service issues. Perhaps thinking about what would happen if their relatives, their parents, were to pass away, and what would that mean for them?
Yeah, I think that's probably quite accurate. So great. So back to our poll results then. So we asked our listeners whether they thought with investing it would be an upward trend or a downward trend. So what have we got? So by far, people are expecting an upward trend. So less interested in investing for the younger people than the older people. So drum roll, please. Let's reveal. There we go. So actually, it's a downward trend. Now, that is obviously not what people necessarily expected. Now, I think that this is heavily influenced by young people learning about ISAs and saving for homes. And I think that second point about saving for home explains the exclusion of the very, very youngest who aren't yet ready to consider buying a home. So yeah, bit of a surprise there, and it shows that you can't judge a book by its cover. Right, so Jenny, back to you. I feel a bit like this is Bruce Forsyth's Play Your Cards Right, for those of you old enough to remember it. But Jenny, back to you. Mortgages, upward trend or downward trend?
I'm going to say downward again, and I'm basing this on my own anecdotal life experience, or maybe peaking in the middle, actually. I'm just looking at where I sit in those age ranges, and somewhere in the middle, and I have indeed, as of a year ago, just gotten my first mortgage. So I'm guessing once people get into the sort of maybe a little bit in the 24, 32, but then the 33, 39 bracket particularly, they're going to be really thinking about that as a priority for them financially. So up and down a bit, just in case it was a trick question from you, Tim.
You've covered all bases with that one. You really have. Yeah, so let's have a look. So mortgages, yeah, we've got a downward trend there. I think simply put, the young want somewhere to live, with a mortgage, almost certainly a necessity. Whereas the older people typically already have somewhere to live with a mortgage. So yeah, that tends to mean they have low interest. Although, yeah, there's amazing how many people aren't getting the best possible deal they could on their mortgages. So perhaps those people with mortgages could do with continuing that learning. We'll cover pensions in a minute, but whilst we're doing that, if I could ask the audience again, savings. So if you could think about savings, the poll should be there again. Let me know if you think that's an upward trend or a downward trend. And whilst they're doing that, Charles, pensions, what do you think? Upward or downward?
I think it would be a upward trend, because the nearer you come to the state retirement age, state pension age in your 60s, then nearer to that you get, the more interested or aware you are of the importance of pensions, which is possibly the wrong way around, because the younger you are when you start saving for your retirement, and the more you're able to contribute, the more of an impact it's going to make. So somebody in their 20s who start saving more, as much as they could, would have certainly more of a larger pension pot than somebody who started, from the same position in their 40s. But I'm assuming it's an upward trend rather than a downward trend.
Yeah, I think I probably agree with you. Let's have a look. Yeah, look at that. Very, very steep. But I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Charles. That is worrying, because, of course, that raises the question about engaging youngest people in pensions. As we know, it's the decisions you take when you're at your youngest that have the biggest impact on your retirement as a result of that compound interest. So that, really is food for thought for people to, try and overcome those natural interests that the younger people have, and really try and find a way to get them to engage with the pensions as early as they can. So next one was savings, which is where we asked the poll. So let's have a look at the poll here. So we asked, would savings be an upward trend or a downward trend? We had 59% of people saying upward trend, 41% downward trend. So let's have a look. There we go. So downward trend. So again, yeah, the minority got that right. So let's have a look at this. So what do you think, Jenny? Is that in line with your expectations? Why do you think that might be?
I don't know. Shows people aren't necessarily saving that much necessarily to pass on in inheritance, doesn't it? If they're kind of less focused on it in later life, which is quite fair enough, I guess. I think that's quite an encouraging picture, really, isn't it? That young people are realising the importance.
I think that's key. I think there's all sorts of research, and it's common sense that the younger people are saving less, but it is encouraging, though, to see that they are more interested in learning about it. So what my interpretation of that is, it's a capability issue rather than a lack of desire to save, which is reassuring in many ways. So lastly, Charles, tax prediction, up or down?
I would imagine that people who are entering the workforce for the first time would be more interested in where their money's going, the taxes they're paying, and how it all works, compared to somebody who's been in the workforce for a number of years. So my assumption is that it is a downward trend.
Right, let's have a look. There we go. So it's a bit of both. It's a bit of a trick question, I guess. It's neither up nor down, bit of a hump. And I think, again, looking at the level, the detail behind this, the content that those people were learning about from a tax perspective was predominantly about property taxes, or what to do with children's ISAs, as well as the impacts of the tax year. So I guess disproportionately, those are the types of topics aimed at people with mortgages and families, which is, I think, hence that hump in the middle, where people tend to have those dependents. So I think, as fun and insightful as that was, grouping the age bands as we did can be dangerous. So flicking on to the next slide now, when trying to really understand what people are interested in order to provide more personalised and useful support, it's important to break the age bands down further. And so what this chart shows is that the learning topics of millennials, which as per the title, up to 33 years old, it shows their, so just that age group, shows their interests by salary. And we can see here that there's some huge differences in the topics and the articles that millennials are learning about based on their pay. The highest earners have more in common with their older peers than they do with their age contemporaries. And there's lots more about this in the white paper. But I think hopefully what this is starting to demonstrate and show you is that this detailed insight is absolutely imperative when designing a financial wellbeing program. It's a level of insight that most employers can only dream of, but obviously critical to create something that's personalised. Charles, I think that you guys have done quite a bit of research into the power and the opportunity of data, and I know you have a few comments on that.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, this information is fantastic. I mean, the CIPD research that we commissioned a few years ago found that many financial well-being factors that were seen as important to employees, such as being able to save for the future or paying off debt, do vary by certain demographic characteristics such as age or gender. So it's crucially important to have this in mind before making decisions. But the same research also found that there are two key components of workplace financial well-being that didn't vary much by age or gender or region or where people worked. And these were being paid enough and being paid fairly. So I think it's always important to have these two factors at the front of your mind when you're thinking about financial well-being of your staff. Are you paying them enough, and are you paying them fairly?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's obviously the foundation, isn't it? Before you can have the other initiatives and products and services you add have any relevance. Okay, great. So yeah, so that is a snapshot of how age and salary influence the type of content we want and we need. We're now going to look at financial stress. And it's so important when you consider the impact financial stress can have on mental health. We did a research piece across the course of that 12-month study where we asked users about how often they felt financially stressed. And we had thousands of respondents, and they give us a rich data set to work with and some really valuable insights. We focused on those people who said that they were often stressed or they felt financial stress every day. And we found some really enlightening stats about how stress changes through a career. And this helps us to better target the support that we're providing. So this next chart shows us the percentage of people who suffer frequent financial stress broken down by age group. So as you can see, the data showed us, for example, that 24% of those youngest people experienced frequent financial stress. Jenny, interested to get your views here, whether that's what you would expect.
I mean, it's not necessarily what you would expect, is it? It's quite a shocking picture in a way to see so many young people are already very stressed about their finances at that point. I mean, I think it's probably reflective of what we talked about earlier in this issue around budgeting and not having a great lot to play with. There's also a factor of insecure work maybe coming through, which I know we talk about a lot in HR circles in relation to a lot of employee demographics, or rather worker demographics. But I was going to just point to some Institute for Employment Studies research actually out last October, which found about 20% of people aged 18 to 24 are in temporary employment because they can't find a permanent job. And I think while older workers in that study were likely to have a fixed contract, young workers were equally as likely as the older workers were to have a fixed contract to have a temporary contract. So it is something that issue of insecure work and 0 hours contracts potentially, which I know for some people work really well, for some people it's not their choice, is disproportionately affecting young people potentially, which may well be a bit of a factor there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously the broad trend there is downwards, and that isn't what I expected to see. But it would appear that, you know, younger people, despite them having fewer financial commitments, they're having a harder time than older colleagues with mortgages or loans or hire purchase agreements, or all of those things that you build up over the course of your career. I guess everything around younger people has got more complicated. Student loans, the job point you mentioned there, perhaps expectations from parents, being bombarded with adverts on Instagram and pressure to buy and keeping up with the Joneses. Yeah, really interesting. What are your thoughts, Charles? Have you guys done any research into stress and the impact, how that varies according to different audiences?
Well, again, the important thing is to have the data, because there's so many factors influencing it. So, for instance, young people in London, they've got lots of pressures, for instance, around commuting, finding a home, saving up, you know, for a house. That can affect their financial well-being and their stress. So I think, you know, the importance of having data that's accurate, having data that you can pull together from different sources, and having the data that you can then analyze to make evidence-based decisions. And I'd recommend that not only should you use evidence to inform the decisions that you make, but also to invest as well in the technology and the expertise that allow you to do so. So this will enable you to kind of explore the figures that you have in more depth, and to check whether you need to tailor your approach before you do something, such as introducing a new benefit or removing an existing one, and also the communications that perhaps you will need to use if you are going to introduce a new benefit or remove it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And I should probably remind people that there is the ability for you to add questions. So we've had some interesting comments and questions already, but feel free to add your questions there, and we'll pick those up at the end. So the next chart here is showing a very clear pattern in financial stress between women and men earning below and above £60,000 a year. Now, 60k is an important figure, because that is the level which academics and research tells us is the point of income satiety. So that's the point that people feel that they have enough. More money is obviously great, but it brings less additional happiness than the money up to £60,000 a year. So the drop-off in stress for women is much more pronounced than that for men. What's your view on this, Jenny?
It's surprising, isn't it? It's a bit of an interesting one, that one. I mean, I think the most straightforward explanation for the bigger percentage of women sitting stressed in the under 60k category, I would suggest, is potentially more women on very low salaries within that, or lowish salaries, nowhere near 60k. I mean, you've got research from the Financial Inclusion Alliance, for example, that estimates 61% of the working poor are female. You know, that's quite a large proportion. I think the more interesting bit is almost why male stress doesn't drop off to the same extent once you're earning a decent amount, like you say, the 60k and over. And I do wonder whether there's a big cultural element in there, really, about, you know, we've still got this legacy of men expected to be the main breadwinners and expected to want ever higher salaries potentially as a result of that. I mean, we included some interesting research in our magazine recently from the University of Bath, which found that husbands were stressed if they were the sole breadwinner, and they became less stressed as their spouse's earnings went up to 40% of the household income. But then as it went over that, they got stressed again. So if their wives' earnings were exceeding 40% of the total household income, they got ever more stressed, you know, depending on what that percentage was. So it seems like there's a real sweet spot here for men, isn't there, where they're going to be stressed. Obviously, they're earning under what they think they should be doing, but if they're on higher wages, you know, the pressure is potentially still potentially great there as well. So yeah, really interesting.
And Charles, I know that you guys have done some research into this as well.
Yes, there's lots of research, but again, I think it just points to the importance of looking at different factors, lots of issues, and also to kind of keep reviewing your data to see if things have changed or whether you need to amend your existing approach in terms of, you know, what you're doing or how you're doing it. And for instance, if we were having this conversation back in January, we may be talking about financial issues, money worries against the backdrop of, you know, the floods that had happened in the Midlands and the North. Now we're talking about it a few months later against the backdrop of coronavirus and the economic issues that has led to.
Yeah, thinking about it, life's quite stressful, isn't it? And yeah, money is obviously such a significant impact. It's a consistent factor for all of our lives. So yeah, I think it's really important for employers to recognise the financial stress, and then, as you say, Charles, recognise how that will differ and across different people, and of course manifest itself in different ways as well. So I guess a bit of a bonus chart here. So what this is showing is about gender differences in terms of age. So yeah, quite striking, isn't it, that women are more stressed than men across every age group, which again adds to that argument that just looking at age or salary or gender alone aren't enough. You need to tailor the information based on an individual's personal situation. Jenny, interested in your views on this. So, you know, as an overall, women more stressed at every age group. Does that surprise you?
Sobering stuff, isn't it? But it does kind of concur with the research that comes out quite consistently to say that women have less financial confidence than men, and it's not very comfortable truth, that, is it? It's almost, you know, a bit of a knotty issue to start addressing, particularly as a HR team, I would suggest. But you know, you've got, what did I jot down? So Close Brothers conducted research last year, and it found women scored an average of 48.1 versus men's 58.3 on 7 areas of financial wellbeing, particularly badly in the areas of budgeting and planning and having confidence in that. And I think that's really tricky, isn't it? Because a lot of women will hear that and think, I don't actually know exactly how to invest my money and budget my money. So a really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it introduces the whole topic, doesn't it, around the pay gap, and of course the compounded impact then of the gender benefits gap as well. Charles, anything there for you to add? Anything you think that you can add to that?
Again, echoing what Jenny has just said, it just kind of brings home the financial situation that women are facing. I mean, whilst men financial stress levels are, you know, it's just 8%, 53 to 60-year-olds. That's 20% among the same age group of women. It just shows you there's so much to do in this area to help women become more financial resilient, and that's everything from ensuring that they're paid enough and being paid fairly to helping them with, you know, financial education and awareness.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. So yeah, looking at the time, I think it's probably worth just summarising, and then we'll have a bit of time to deal with questions as well. So I guess to summarise, with our financial context being made up of those macro events, whether that's the floods or coronavirus or government changes, Brexit, goodness me, I've forgotten about that temporarily, then the personal life events, our personal demographics. As a result of all of these things, our financial context is complicated and hugely personalised to who we are. So this snapshot that we've been through today from our white paper, which we'll send to you after this, shows how even a small subset of our changing demographic can have a big impact on and influence our financial wants, needs, and feelings. This in turn influences the financial skills and knowledge that we require, and therefore the financial education that we need in order to acquire and develop those skills and knowledge. And that in turn is going to influence your behaviours, your decisions, and ultimately the actions that you take with regards to your money. So if you do all of these things, you may achieve this nirvana of financial well-being. But as all of these factors keep changing, your wants and your needs, and therefore your skills and your knowledge, are going to keep evolving. It's not a straight or static line. And it's in that sense that financial well-being is a living, breathing strategy. Living, breathing thing, and therefore the strategy has to be living and breathing too. It needs to be highly personalised, timely, learn and adapt, and connect all of the right problems with the right solutions at the right time. Charles, I don't know if you've got a comment on that at all.
No, just to reiterate that employee financial well-being is an evolving issue. So issues that perhaps were at the front of people's minds a couple of years ago or a couple of months ago and are no longer potentially relevant. New issues have come along. So organizations need to kind of keep checking the financial sector, their employees, as the expression is at the moment, keep testing, and then to kind of use that information to change your approach. Either perhaps things don't need to change, or if they do need to change, it may be how you kind of communicate or educate with your workers.
Okay, fantastic. Right. So picking up on that then, so assuming that strategy and that solution does need to evolve and change, how do you do that? And these are the key principles of designing not just any financial wellbeing strategy, but a living and breathing one, so one that's changing with the times. So I think firstly, map out your financial wellbeing ecosystem. So you need to connect all of the different products and services that you offer and make sure they're all working towards the same goal. First, though, of course, what are your objectives? Are you trying to reduce stress? Is it about increasing saving? Ultimately, what does financial well-being mean for your business? It's amazing how some people think of financial well-being as a tick box exercise, and it's certainly not. Secondly, make education the beating heart. So with money underpinning all of your benefits, financial well-being is a brilliant umbrella phrase to be used to promote benefits, but it can be very dangerous to promote those benefits without giving people the tools, so the financial education, to make sure they really understand their money and ultimately the decisions they're making. What's the tax impact? What's the long-term opportunity versus the short-term sacrifice, for example? So focus on developing skills and knowledge so employees can make informed decisions is really important. Thirdly, data. So Charles spoke quite passionately about, I guess, the power of that data and the fact that it can be quite hard to come by. It's pretty obvious, hopefully, from the session we've been through, that data means that you can avoid guesswork in designing what support you're going to offer. So you can use that data to understand what people need and want, and then develop a personalized solution as a result. Number 4, a lot of talk today about those macro changes. So at the moment it's coronavirus, it was the floods. Previously it was the change in the state retirement age for women. All of these things are changing all of the time. So you need to make sure that any solution you're delivering has that real life context, makes it real to people, and shows your people that they're engaging with something which is accurate and up to date. Number 5, talk in a style that engages. So money is really complicated, and it's difficult to create that long-term behavioral change without working quite hard to create that regular snackable content that makes it easy for employees to digest. And it's also worth keeping in mind that the financial decision maker may not always be the employee. So make it as easy as possible for your recipient employees to share the communication and the knowledge and the tools with the family. And I think, Charles, you've got some research coming up on exactly that point. Is that right?
Yeah, just looking at the power of apps. How do people now access information about their pensions? Growing number are now looking at their apps for that. And also how people are managing their money. There's more and more financial budgeting tools out there. I know that my own colleagues are often kind of managing their money through these apps, and often sometimes surprised by how much money they're spending on certain things, such as how much they're spending in their local pubs.
Yeah, sounds like a fun group of employees, although yeah, they're going to be slightly limited on that for the next few weeks, I think. So the next, I guess, key point then is around tech for scale. So most of the things we've talked about can be automated with tech, but of course the other opportunity that tech gives you is the ability to monitor those outcomes. So to really track how somebody's interaction and ultimately their behaviours are changing over time. And then lastly, it's about recognizing that things change. So create a strategy that learns. And a key part of that is measuring outcomes. So who's engaging with the wellbeing strategy and who isn't? What are people learning about? What are they learning? What gaps might you have in your financial wellbeing ecosystem? Living and breathing doesn't just mean that the strategy is constantly communicating in a personalized and timely way. It's at the highest level, it's that the strategy's changing with times as well. There's lots to digest there. I say there's a hugely detailed white paper that provides some brilliant information that will follow. But hopefully that was useful. Don't suppose before we take any questions whether there's anything you'd like to add, Jenny?
No, I think let's just move on to the questions so we can get a few in before the end, if that's all right, guys.
Great, yeah.
And do send in any more questions. We've got a few that have come in, but we'd always like even more to choose from. So if you suddenly think of a burning question you've not asked us yet, do just pop it across. But we'll start. Let me have a look. So we've got one from Ian McFowle here, who's director at Hill Street. He says, given that COVID-19 is such a massive shock to the financial system, has it knocked the strategic approach into the long grass for the next couple of years, which I think is sort of getting at this, which will apply to many areas that HR is involved in? Does it mean that actually wider activity around financial well-being needs to be put on the back burner for a bit whilst HR teams grapple with the very immediate implications and challenges, financial challenges that coronavirus is presenting?
I think, sorry, Tim here, and I think the exact opposite. So to give you an example, we are going live with a very large insurance company, supposed to be going live in a month's time. We got a panicked call from the last week saying we need to launch this sooner. What is really clear is that people are struggling. There's so much conflicting information. They rely on us. They trust us as an employer to help them. How can we get nudge live sooner? So I think, yes, decision making may be prolonged as people are worrying about keeping the lights on. But I think the need for financial well-being support has never been bigger as a result of the, as you say, the massive shock that we're seeing.
Charles, did you want to jump in on that at all?
Well, yes. I mean, I think the financial crisis and caused by COVID-19 is going to expose how integrated and whether reward strategies are living and breathing, or whether they are, as Tim said earlier, a tick box exercise. Your employees are going to be crucial in helping your organization recover from this financial crisis. So therefore, it's important that you kind of invest in their physical, mental, and financial well-being. And hopefully, organizations have kind of learned from previous experiences, such as the 2008 financial crisis, that suddenly a short-term knee-jerk reaction to kind of introducing slashing and burning may not be what is going to get you out of this hole. I mean, you may survive the immediate crisis, but you may then lose out to your competitors because they have invested more in treating their employees fairly and making sure that the resources are going to their financial, mental, and physical well-being.
I think that's a really brilliant call to arms, Charles. On, as I say, many areas of HR, you've got to still keep an eye, as difficult as it seems at the moment, on the long term, and making sure that you've got a holistic HR strategy, and certainly wellbeing and financial wellbeing strategy. And this is sort of why you need one, isn't it? So it stands you in good stead for these kind of times. Right, I'm going to move on to another question now that's just come in from Pamela Cowan, who is Head of OD and Talent at Oldham College. She says, what are your thoughts both on practical provisions such as the schemes available to take your salary prior to being paid? So she says, I wonder about the benefit of this and whether it is just a payday loan with less or no interest. My understanding is that most of them operate on being able to draw down money you've earned to the date of payment. What do you reckon about the value of those? Charles, do you want to kick us off on that one?
Yes, I mean, I suppose the question is, people do get into a financial crisis. You know, very few people have a financial buffer. So if a problem happens to their boiler or their car, they can find themselves suddenly in a financial difficulty. And so what can the employer do to help them? It may be that the employer themselves can provide that emergency access to funding. If not, then perhaps they can then help their employees through a third party to access their money. I think what is important is that this doesn't become a habit, that employees realise that this is just for a particularly rainy day. And what would be a more sustainable approach is to help them build up their own financial buffers, you know, savings, workplace, you know, insurance products through the workplace. And there's lots of interesting work at the moment being done by the pension provider Nest. They have kind of launched a kind of a experiment looking at the concept of a savings vehicle, which they call sidecar, where when you contribute your pension, you're also contributing a little bit extra to this kind of sidecar savings product, which is supposed to act as a rainy day fund. So if there are problems, you can access that rather than getting into financial difficulty.
Brilliant. Tim, did you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I quite simply, I think those products are really quite dangerous. So yeah, if financial well-being is about helping people develop the skills and knowledge, allowing people to take their pay early is doing the opposite. You know, they're not learning to budget there. I think also the big problem is the misalignment with the provider. You know, the provider will make their money by people doing this regularly. So to Charles's point, it's fine if it's a one-off, but that isn't going to be the provider's commercial motivation. And I think there's also another impact that a lot of people don't necessarily see, is that it locks people in. You know, if you get somebody into that cycle of taking their pay weekly rather than monthly, what happens when it's actually the right time for them to move on, but they're locked in because they can't afford to move to a new employer who only pays them monthly? So it's early days for those products, but for me, it feels quite dangerous.
Really interesting, because yeah, you do see a lot of them springing up at the moment. Brilliant. Let's squeeze in at least one more question. So this one's from Paula Grayson. I think it's less of a question, something she's struggled with or struggling with and wanted some advice or tips on. So she says, I approve of enrollment as a nudge method, but I've discovered that some employers state staff need to contact the pensions provider to opt out, but the provider states they need to have the person's information from the employer, which makes opting out very difficult. So maybe this is a deliberate thing on the government's part or on someone's part to try and keep people in. But are there any tips you guys would offer around that?
So Tim here. So I think, you know, let's remember the objective of auto enrolment and the nudge behind it is to get people to stay in a pension. So what I do know is you can't opt out of a pension until you're in it to start with. And that process, when you consider pay cycle and you consider sending schedules to pension providers, can take a long time. So yeah, it might feel complicated. I think that's partly on purpose and partly just a virtue of the way that a payroll cycle works.
Mm-hmm. Charles, anything to comment there? Or maybe, Charles, you could offer some tips on actually engaging younger people with pensions. It was a really interesting graph we saw earlier, wasn't it? That it's actually the older you get, the more engaged you're going to be with your pension, but we actually need people to be engaged and seeing the importance of it earlier on. What would you say?
I mean, there's one issue around being young and auto enrolment is that possibly because you are less engaged, you're more likely to not opt out once you've been put into a pension. Making sure that people are actually looking at whether what they've been opted into makes sense for them and opportunities to increase their contributions over time. The people who are more likely to be opting out of a pension are those who are in their 50s and 60s, and that might be because they've already got other pension savings and they're concerned also about impact and potential tax implications. What I would say is that even for people in their 50s or 60s now, being in a pension can be quite a good way of saving for old age. There've been lots of movements around how you can make access to pensions more flexible. You can do more things with your DC pension. That said, there are also concerns around how people are out there who are trying to scam people from their pensions. So you also need, as Tim would say, being aware through your education process about why it's a good thing to be in a pension, but also to remind people about the pitfalls and how people are out there trying to scam you as well, unfortunately.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Charles. We probably have to wrap it up fairly shortly, I would suggest. I wondered whether either of you had some last, just to end on a more positive note maybe than pension scams, were there any last bits of food for thought or kind of pearls or wisdom you would like to offer our audience just to sum it all up today? Tim, was there anything you wanted to finish on?
Yeah, that'd be great. So, yeah, quite simply, I think that there's no disputing that financial well-being is a massive problem at the moment. But as an employer, you're in a unique position to help your people. They trust you in a way that they don't trust financial services institutions. You know more about them than in many cases they know about themselves. And you're also providing the lion's share of their financial provision anyway. So it's a privilege to be able to help them, and it's great to see more and more employers taking that responsibility and obligation.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. Charles, anything you'd like to end on?
Just to reiterate what Tim has just said, I mean, employees are uniquely placed to help their employees with their employee financial well-being. However, you can't just outsource this issue to employers themselves. Employees have a responsibility themselves, as do other stakeholders, including the government and the financial services industry. So employers have an important role, but they also have to be supported by other key stakeholders as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both. Thank you both for sharing such fascinating views, and thanks, Tim, for the brilliant presentation. To anyone asking, the webinar will be available on demand 24 hours after this live session finishes. So you'll be able to share it with colleagues or rewatch at your leisure. A link will be sent over to you all as you've registered in the next 24 hours. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but yeah, thanks again to the guys. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your day.